On one such night, Eric and Guy were having a lot to drink, and they ran out of beer and they drove to go and get more. On the way to the liquor store, they were driving erratically and actually drove right into a cop car that was on its way to my house. They were of course arrested for drunk driving and public intoxication, but once they searched the car and found drugs in the trunk, they were also charged with drug trafficking and possession as well. My name is Paul, and my family has caused me a massive amount of grief, although it wasn't always that way. Things were different when I was young. My mother and father had a picture-perfect marriage, and they spoiled me. Although all of that was thrown into turmoil in my teens. I was 15 at the time, and I remember one day helping my father work on his car when he suddenly collapsed, gripping his chest. We called for an ambulance, but unfortunately, they didn't arrive in time and he passed away. Sadly, there were no warning signs, but he did have very unhealthy eating habits, and the fact that he passed away from a heart attack, while tragic, wasn't that far-fetched. My mother and I took the loss fairly hard, but after a few years, my mother began dating. I would say that was the lead-up to things becoming quite unpleasant for me. I loved my mother, but aside from my father, she had terrible taste in men. Some of the guys she dated would treat me like I didn't exist, and more than a few treated her like their personal bank account. Thankfully, she broke up with all of those, but eventually Simon came along and he managed to convince her that he was different than the other men she had dated. I suspected that he wasn't, but my mother was convinced, and that was all that mattered. Regardless, my mother seemed happy, and so I kept my opinions of Simon to myself, even when they had a rushed engagement and got married. Simon had 3 children of his own from a previous marriage. 2 sons, Guy and Eric, and a daughter named Sarah. Sarah and I got along really well as we bonded over our love of playing golf, but Guy and Eric were absolute bullies. They would torment Sarah and I. The sad part is that no matter what they would do to us, Simon would dismiss it as boys just being boys. They were his kids, so I could understand his reaction to a degree, but for my own mom to excuse their behavior just so that she could maintain peace in the household, though, made me furious.
Hey there, Paul. Sorry to hear about your loss.
Loss? What are you talking about?
Oh, you haven't seen yet? Someone used Sarah's computer monitor to smash your computer monitor, and now both of them are broken. Weird, huh?
You idiot. Why would you do something like this? Why do you always have to damage our stuff? Funny thing was that it wasn't even the first time that Eric and Guy had damaged our computers, and Simon's solution was to get my mother to just buy replacements for the things they would break. Honestly, I think that my mother probably spent thousands of dollars replacing all the things that Guy and Eric would break. I could not for the life of me figure out why she was just letting them get away with murder. My mother had always been a huge pacifist, but I had never understood just how much she was willing to take to avoid conflict. When I turned 18, Simon came and told me that I would need to start paying rent if I still wanted to live at home. And that was it. That was the last straw for me. Why do I have to pay rent when Guy and Eric don't? They're older than me. Well, they don't have jobs, but you do, so it's only fair. That doesn't make sense. Why don't you force them to get jobs then? Again, they are older, and they aren't even in school. Well, when it's your house, then you can make the rules. For now, this is my house, and you can either live by my rules, or you can move out. Well then, I choose to move out. Funny enough, I had already been planning on moving out anyways, as I was sick of having to deal with being bullied by Eric and Guy, and I had even managed to find an apartment that was close to my college that I could afford. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was my own. I was forced to buy secondhand furniture and money was very tight for the years that I was in school, but I made it work and my mother would come and visit a couple times a week and would bring me groceries and even slip some money in my pocket from time to time. Even though they were hard years, they were some of the best in my life, and when I graduated, I put a good word in with my landlord so that he would rent out my apartment to Sarah, who wanted to follow in my footsteps and move out when she turned 18 as well. As for me, I managed to get myself an entry-level job, and with the increase in pay compared to my old part-time job, I was able to get myself a much nicer place to live. Just as my mother had done for me, though. I would visit Sarah and help her out when I could, and make sure that she was safe and doing well in school. During her last year, though, tragedy reared its ugly face once again, and my mother became sick. When she went to the doctors to find out what was wrong, they told her that she had cancer and had less than a year to live. She quickly made sure that all her affairs were in order, and we spent as much time together as a family as possible. But the day came when her cancer had become too much, and she passed away. I knew that technically I wasn't an orphan, but I felt like one. I had lost both of my parents, and I was left with a stepfather that I truly despised. At my mother's funeral, both Eric and Guy appeared to be bored, but thankfully, Sarah comforted me, as she was just as distraught as I was. It was a very hard day to get through, and it would only get worse after that. A few days later, my mother's lawyer had my step-siblings, stepfather, and I gather in her office for the reading of my mother's will. She looked very nervous as she looked at the five of us, which made me wonder what was in the will.
So, I just want to start off by saying that what is in the will was your mother and wife's wishes, but they are also the wishes of your father, Paul. He left quite a bit of money to your mother when he passed, and it was his wishes that should she pass as well, that it all go to you.
Wait a minute, what are you saying?
Well, your late wife did leave you and each of your children $15,000, but the house and the remaining funds all go to Paul.
The lawyer continued to explain that the house had originally been in my father's family for a few generations, and that it meant the world to him for me to one day own it and have a family there as well. The look on Simon's face filled me with so much joy. I know that I shouldn't feel so much pleasure in his anger, but I couldn't help it. Well, I guess that means that the house is now mine. So how do you want to address this?
What do you mean? There's nothing to address. It's our home.
I'm sorry, Simon, but it belongs to me. If it hadn't been in the family for multiple generations, then I could see renting it or even selling it to you. But my parents' wishes were pretty clear. I don't expect you to move out tomorrow, but I intend to live there alone.
Uh-huh, we'll see.
Just before I left the lawyer's office, she slipped me a note and told me to open it later when I was alone. I waited until I got home, and once I read it, I understood why the will had been written the way that it had. Apparently, my mother had found out that Simon had cheated on her more than once, and while she never had the courage to confront him about it, she nevertheless wouldn't let him get away with having violated her trust either. As for the small amount of money that she gave to his children, she felt it was only fair to give them such a small amount, on account that they helped to cover up his affairs, and they were complicit. She did ask that I give Sarah $25,000 from my share when she graduated from college, as she was innocent and didn't know about her father's deeds. As for the house, I knew that Simon was planning something very nasty, but if he thought that he could still boss me around, he had another thing coming. After all, I was no longer a child, and he had no leverage over me whatsoever. A week after I inherited the house, I moved back in. I wasn't the least bit surprised to find that Guy, Eric, and Simon hadn't made any effort at all to move out. No boxes were packed, and all three of them were still strutting around like they owned the place. Guys, listen, I want to be fair. I know that you don't think that this is a very fair decision, but it's what my parents wanted, and it's legally binding. I'm going to give you 30 days to find a place to live. With the money that you got from my mother, that should be more than doable.
As if I already spent that money on a new sports car. Yeah, and mine is going to make me rich as I bet it all on an upcoming boxing match. Paul, you need to listen to me. There was an obvious mistake in the reading of the will. Your mother wouldn't have left me with so little. I'll have you know that I plan to fight this will in court, so I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were you.
Over the next couple of weeks, the three of them tried to bully me to get me to leave. They tried to play music at all hours of the night, but I called the cops on them, and the police forced them to turn it off. They then tried to trash my room, but I changed the locks on the doors to the rooms that I claimed as my own and installed security cameras. The locks on the doors weren't enough to stop them, but the cameras did. None of them wanted me to call the cops on them again. By the third week, though, they appeared to have lost some steam, but I knew it was a ruse. My mother's lawyer informed me that they had hired a lawyer of their own to open a case and try to get my mother's will dismissed, saying that it was a fake will. But she assured me that it was ironclad and that their case would go nowhere. More than once, they would throw parties and invite girls over and party until sunrise. I usually would call the police on them, and it got to the point where the police included my house on their normal route just to make it easier for them. On one such night, Eric and Guy were having a lot to drink, and they ran out of beer and they drove to go and get more. On the way to the liquor store, they were driving erratically and actually drove right into a cop car that was on its way to my house. They were, of course, arrested for drunk driving and public intoxication, but once they searched the car and found drugs in the trunk, they were also charged with drug trafficking and possession as well. The next day, Simon begged me to help them out and give them money so that they could hire lawyers, but I wasn't having it. Sure, I'll give them some money, but only if all three of you move out and never come back. You can't do that. This is our home. No, Simon, it's my home. And since it's my home, I get to make the rules. If you don't like them, well, I don't care. Because right now, my number one rule is that I want you and your monstrous boys out of my house. As much as he wanted the money to help Guy and Eric, he was far too stubborn and petty to agree to leave. He was willing to let his sons go to jail just so he didn't have to move out, but the joke was on him. As the rightful owner to the house, I was able to call up the police and have him forcibly removed, and then I had a restraining order put on him so that if he came within 500 feet of the house, that I could charge him with trespassing and have him arrested. After that, I didn't hear from them for a couple of months, although I did hear that they weren't doing all that great. Eric ended up losing his entire inheritance since he lost the bet that he had placed it on, and Guy's car had been impounded and repossessed, which meant he lost his portion as well. Simon was the only one with any money left, but he was forced to give it to his sons to cover their legal fees, but it barely paid for everything. And sadly, they still ended up going to jail. It hadn't been their first drunk driving offense, and since they damaged a police car, the judge wasn't lenient on them at all. The good news didn't stop coming though, as Simon's case was dismissed as my mother's lawyer had been correct in saying that the will was ironclad. I had heard that he was forced to get a job at a home improvement store in order to afford an apartment very much like the one that I had in college. It felt like poetic justice, really. As for me, well, I used some of the money I had inherited to fix up and renovate my new home so that it was truly my own, and I'm happy to say that my girlfriend has recently become my fiancé and will be moving in with me in a few weeks. On top of that, as a welcoming party for her, we are also having a graduation party for Sarah since she will be finishing college in a couple weeks as well. I can't wait to see the look on her face when I give her the graduation gift that my mom wanted her to have. If you enjoyed the story, smash the like button and subscribe. Delilah?
Yes, Mr. Ben.
May I ask you how you're in this class? I thought your kind was uneducated and lazy.
We're not all like that. I try to learn. That's kind of stereotyping.
Well, you're just special. Why are you getting all offended now? I was only just complimenting you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Delilah, or you can call me Lila. I have a story that I think people will be interested in. It's about a substitute teacher at the high school I attended. He was one of the most horrible people I've ever met, and I'm glad that he wasn't a permanent teacher and didn't come by too frequently. Although I did feel bad for the other classes that he constantly substituted for. So like I said, this teacher didn't come by my class very often. But on the days he did sub in for our classes was basically torture. I am biracial. I'm specifically Afro-Latina. This teacher, let's call him Mr. Ben, did not really like people like me. As a result, I was a target of Mr. Ben most of the time. For a good bit of my high school years, Mr. Ben would attack me with many race-related insults and act very stereotypical towards me and a few other students of color. He started off with very subtle words and things that many of us didn't really pick up on until we finally realized the type of person he was.
Jelani, you like sports? Yeah. I bet you must be very good at basketball. You'd probably be the next Michael Jordan. Not really, I'm trying though.
So when you first hear this, you might think that it was just a compliment. However, you have to admit that it's a little strange and stereotyping Jelani. Nobody thought so, or at least spoke up about it, since this sounded better than blatantly saying something to our fellow classmates' face. But this was only the beginning. Of course, things progressively get worse and worse as time goes on. The next time he substituted, it was for history class. Our lesson for that day was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I still remember because it was an easy and interesting topic for me. We had sat in class and waited for our teacher to walk in. I think you could imagine the look of horror I had on my face when Mr. Ben walked in. Mr. Ben definitely didn't know how to teach history. There was nothing I could do, though. The substitute teacher walked in and looked at the class with a smug look on his face.
Hello, students. This is history class, is it not? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about why the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the worst things to be issued. The most obvious thing, it freed slaves. Now we have to pay for other people to do work for us. At least back then, it was a one-time payment sort of thing.
Yeah. Clearly, this was starting to get really weird. Either Mr. Ben had not heard about the constant struggles that slaves went through, or he decided to avoid that major fact completely. My classmates and I were quite shocked, since this was definitely outrageous for someone to say, especially a teacher. Oh, and of course, I'm quite sure that the Civil War barely had any sort of immediate correlation with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was what we were really supposed to be learning that day. As you can imagine, Mr. Ben got more confident with his racial remarks. I have so many instances of his behavior, but I'll tell you about some of them.
Delilah?
Yes, Mr. Ben.
May I ask you how you're in this class? I thought your kind was uneducated and lazy.
We're not all like that. I try to learn. That's kind of stereotyping.
Well, you're just special. Why are you getting all offended now? I was only just complimenting you.
Damn it, this guy was annoying. I was only just trying to tell him that his statement was honestly kind of a weird thing to say, but he turned around and got upset at me, claiming that what he'd said was just him trying to be nice to me. But it wasn't like I could really say anything. I knew that other staff would try to defend him and say that he was a sweet old man or whatever, that he probably didn't know that that was stereotypical. There was another time where Mr. Ben asked me if I knew how to talk to monkeys and if I ever had one as a pet. Like, what in the world is this substitute thinking? He has so much time to decide that a question is not a good idea, yet he always comes out and just makes everyone feel bad. Mr. Ben was quite brave. I had to give this to him. But I absolutely hated his guts. Our principal was a black woman, and this bitch of a teacher liked to talk trash about her behind her back. So not only would he bully me and other kids like me, he also bullied our school's own principal. He'd say things such as,
I wonder how Principal Lana got her job. I feel like she had to cheat her way there. There's no way someone like her did well enough in school to be a proper principal.
He'd also say,
It's weird hearing Principal Lana speak like a white person. I thought her kind only used slang and such.
So is he implying that black individuals shouldn't be educated? I think that's exactly where this is going. But I think the most infuriating part is the fact that Mr. Ben would suck up to our principal so much, and she ended up announcing him as the substitute teacher of the year. Wow, if only she knew sooner how much of a horrible person he was. Anyway, though, him earning that title wasn't a big deal to me, even though I felt really bad for Principal Lana. However, there was one last instance that did it for me. Mr. Ben was substituting for our science class, and we had a pop quiz. I was just jotting down my answers when Mr. Ben began to ask me to create a formula that could make things lighter. I was just starting to answer, but I caught on. I admit, I got a little angered because I knew this was just another sly way to imply that he didn't like my color and wanted me to get lighter. Do you think I'm exaggerating? Listen to what happened next. Why do I need to tell you the answer? It's not part of our current curriculum.
Oh, I know, Delilah. I was just giving you some personal suggestions, and I suggest you take them. You'd be such a beauty with lighter skin.
You see that now? I yelled at him, and this got me an after-school detention. I was absolutely enraged, and in that moment of anger, I came up with a brilliant plan that I wanted to execute with a friend of mine. About a week after the incident, my friend Mia and I were ready. We had been asking around for a week, trying to find out what time the principal came out of her office to check on the school. Some of the student assistants told us that it was usually around noon when she'd come out. This was great. We didn't need any hall passes to make this happen. We also did a bit of snooping and managed to snag a women's lingerie magazine from Mr. Ben's bag. This was the absolute best thing to use for what we were about to pull off. Our plan was simple. We stand somewhere we know the principal will walk by and begin reading the magazine out loud. Hopefully she hears and tries to question us. In response, we will tell her that Mr. Ben offered to let us read it, and he will get in big trouble. So the day this plan was put into action, Mia and I sat on a picnic bench near a sidewalk that we knew was a common place for students and staff to walk by. We started to read the magazine and made sure that the photo of the woman on the cover was very obvious for someone to see. It was kind of embarrassing in the first 10 minutes since many classmates stared at us like we had escaped from an asylum. This was nothing, though. Our target was just Principal Lana. But then the unthinkable happened. Mr. Ben walked down the sidewalk. Oh, snap. We only noticed him when he was 4 feet away from us, and by then the substitute knew what we had in our hands.
What in the hell are you girls doing with my magazine? No wonder I couldn't find it in my bag. You two are just some stupid and mindless thieves.
Sir, this is your magazine? Mia was playing the innocent card. This was smart. But since this was unexpected, we were both scared.
Of course it's my magazine. Give it back.
I flinched as Mr. Ben tried grabbing the magazine back from us, and I threw it into the bushes nearby. The substitute growled at us and began to say a bunch of nasty words. Let's just say there were a few bad slurs thrown at Mia and me. Today was going to be our death day. Or maybe not, because another huge thing happens. That day was just such a blur of event after event.
Mr. Ben, what do you think you're doing bullying my students like this? I stood here and listened to you insulting them for 5 minutes straight now.
The principal herself has come out to save the day. Just like we had with Mr. Ben, we didn't notice Principal Lana, but I assume she'd been hearing everything for a while now. Mia and I now watched with amusement as the principal called for security. Mr. Ben got dragged away, and Principal Lana told us to come to her office, where we gave our statements about Mr. Ben and how he was a horrid person. She listened and agreed. She really had heard all of the bad stuff he said to us, and she would be firing him immediately. I think I might have celebrated for a week straight due to my happiness. Finally, Mr. Ben was gone. I went on to live my life happily, now knowing that some crummy substitute teacher with this deep hatred wouldn't bother me for a while. Months after I graduated, I read a news article about a white male who had gotten killed during an altercation between him and a few black males. A video was attached to it. In the video, I saw Mr. Ben walking up to people eating food and yelling, standing in a very threatening pose. Then the people he yelled at stood up and they shoved each other for a bit before Mr. Ben ran for whatever reason. Seconds later, a taxi slammed into him. Yikes. Even after getting fired, Mr. Ben hadn't learned anything. He chose to even pick fights with people that were just trying to enjoy their day. Is it weird that his death was kind of satisfying for me? Let me know, and thank you for listening to this story.
My own brother had robbed a bank while pretending to be me, and I was now a wanted man. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. Police, open up. I opened the door and was met with a swarm of policemen with their weapons drawn and pointed at me. Andrew, you're under arrest for burglary. You won't be seeing daylight for a very long time. No, I swear it wasn't me. It was my evil twin brother. Yeah, right. We've heard that one before. Nice try. Now come with us. My name is Andrew, and I'm a 26-year-old teacher. I love teaching. It's the best way I can give back to future generations. And after all, the world needs good teachers. Anyways, I live a very quiet life in a small town. I don't go out much, and I spend my nights playing chess most of the time. So you can imagine my surprise when I was abruptly arrested for a bank robbery, a crime I did not commit. It didn't take long to figure out what had really happened, and I'm gonna explain everything that led up to my evil twin brother, almost causing me to rot in prison. Growing up, my twin brother Kyle was always the favorite. Even as a toddler, he would throw tantrums and scream and cry when he wanted something. But instead of reprimanding him, my parents would just give him what he wanted. One day when we were both 13, we were all sitting down for a family dinner when Kylie said he wanted to make an announcement. Go ahead, son. Tell us what's on your mind. What could this possibly be about? Shut up, Andrew. You're not allowed to speak at the dinner table. Only Kyle is. This is why Kyle is our favorite. He would never act this way. Go ahead, Kyle. Ignore your brother and tell us your announcement. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I was arrested earlier for shoplifting, and I have to go to court and will need a ride. Okay, that's no problem, son.
I will drive you to court, then we will go get ice cream after.
I couldn't believe my ears when I heard that my parents were not going to punish Kyle for shoplifting. He could do no wrong in their eyes, and I was just going to have to deal with it. Of course, this behavior only got worse as Kyle was not learning right from wrong because of bad parenting. Also, things continuously got worse, as Kyle began to realize he was the favorite and started bullying me because of it.
Hey Andrew, guess what?
What?
Mom and Dad love me so much more than you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Tomorrow we are going on a vacation to the beach without you.
You're mean. I hate being your twin. One day you'll get what's coming to you. Nobody can act this way and get away with it.
Yeah, right. I'll never get in trouble. Earlier today I was robbing the elderly, and nobody caught me. Tonight, I plan on stealing kids' bikes and reselling them. I love crime.
It was clear there was no steering Kyle in the right direction. He was a lost cause. As I grew up, I distanced myself from my toxic family as much as possible and worked hard in school, and eventually graduated with a degree in education. My parents didn't even come to see me get my diploma because they were too busy taking Kyle on a shopping spree. Kyle had decided not to go to college and instead committed to a life of crime. His crimes were slowly starting to grow, and one day he even called me and confessed to robbing a liquor store, which was his biggest crime yet. I tried one last time to get him to change his ways, but he just called me a loser and hung up. I decided I should go talk to my parents after years of not seeing them, to try and fix this situation.
Oh, it's you. What do you want?
Why are you even here? We only love Kyle. Hasn't that been clear to you?
Yes, you've made that very clear. I wanted to talk to you about Kyle. I'm worried about him. He's a horrible person, but he is my twin brother, and I still care about him. I think we should send him to rehab and get him off of his crime spree.
Andrew, Kyle is fine. All he needs is our love and support, and that's what we're going to give him. Now get out of my house, you little weasel.
That was the last time I ever spoke to my parents. They had gone too far. The next day, I saw in the newspaper that there was a huge bank robbery in my hometown, and that they were searching for the perpetrator. I almost passed out when they showed a picture from the security cameras, and it was my twin brother, wearing an outfit that I would wear. I looked closer and realized that he was wearing a name tag that said, Andrew, and it was clear to me what had happened. My own brother had robbed a bank while pretending to be me, and I was now a wanted man. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door.
Police, open up.
I opened the door and was met with a swarm of policemen with their weapons drawn and pointed at me.
Andrew, you're under arrest for burglary. You won't be seeing daylight for a very long time.
No, I swear it wasn't me. It was my evil twin brother.
Yeah, right. We've heard that one before. Nice try. Now come with us.
I was thrown in jail for a crime I didn't even commit, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I tried to explain to everyone what was going on, but nobody listened. I knew there was only one way to set things right. I was going to have to catch my brother myself. This was going to be exceptionally hard considering I was in prison, but after thinking all night, I finally had a plan. I demanded that I receive my one phone call and asked for my call to be monitored by an officer. Once I knew the officer was listening in to my call, I dialed my brother's phone number. I knew I would be able to get my brother to confess, just like he had in the past.
Hello? Andrew?
Yup, it's me. I just saw my face on the news. They are saying that I am wanted for a bank robbery. Be honest with me, though. You're the one that actually robbed that bank, and then you set me up, didn't you?
Yape, you're 100% correct. I'll admit it. I set you up. It was just too easy because we look exactly alike. I knew you would get blamed instead of me.
So you were the one who robbed the bank?
Yes. I already said that it was me. Are you hard of hearing or something?
And where are you now?
I'm hiding out in Mom and Dad's basement until the heat dies down. I have millions of dollars now, and I'm going to get to spend it while you rot in prison after they catch you. Ha ha. I win and you lose.
At last, the truth was revealed. My plan had worked, and my brother was finally going to face justice. I was quickly released from prison, and I showed the police to my parents' house. The police quickly rushed inside and apprehended my brother. I got to witness the whole thing as my brother was hauled away in handcuffs. But it got even better when I saw my parents being arrested for helping aid a known felon. They were going to get at least 2 years in prison, because they were helping my brother hide out in their basement. Well, look how things played out.
Honey, I'm sorry. I loved you all along. We should have treated you better.
Well, that's easy to say now, isn't it?
Your mom is right, son. You were the good one all along. Kyle has got us arrested. He's dead to us now. We love you.
Sorry, but I'm not interested in having any kind of relationship with you. Have fun rotting in prison. Just then, a police officer approached me and told me he had great news. The millions of dollars my brother had stolen was going to be rewarded to me instead. Apparently, it was a gift since I had helped crack the case, and I was now a millionaire. The look on my parents' face when they realized this was happening was priceless. My brother heard about it too, and he immediately started crying like a baby.
Son, now that you're rich, surely you'll bail us out, right?
Absolutely not. Now get out of my sight. They were finally hauled off to jail, and I went with them just to see it happen. Afterwards, I began spending my millions on different things. For one, I was able to retire from teaching and immediately took a vacation to the best beach in the world. I bought fancy cars and even donated $100,000 to charity. Then I reported the police officers who arrested me without doing any investigation. One even punched me that day and gave me black eye, and they were fired because they didn't do their job properly and didn't even listen to me. I saw in the newspaper a couple weeks later that my parents had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for hiding a criminal. As for my brother, well, when they heard how horrible he had been to me all my life and how he had set me up, they gave him the maximum sentence possible, 20 years. Some people think I should have bailed my family out and taken care of them, but I don't think so. What do you think? Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.
And then went to check the back door. As he did, my father surprise attacked him and jumped on him, and while on top of him, punched him until Mark was unconscious. He then tied him up and then rushed over to untie me. I was grateful, but I needed to check on my baby, and so I rushed upstairs and saw that he was okay. Hi there, my name is Jessica, but everyone calls me Jessie, and I wanted to share a story about my father. You see, he's kind of my hero, and I know that a lot of people say that about their parents, but my father actually is one. Here, let me tell you my story, and I think that in the end, that you'll agree with me. Growing up, my father and I got along really well. I was pretty much a daddy's girl, but rather than playing with dolls and tea sets, my dad taught me how to fish and to hunt. Things did change when I became a teenager, and we didn't spend quite as much time together, but we were still very close. And then when I went off to college, I made a point of calling him and my mom at least a few times a week, just to stay in touch. It was there at college that I met Mark. We were in many of the same classes, and he was such a charming guy. So much so that I pretty much fell in love with him immediately. By second year, we were dating, and over the Christmas holidays, he joined me when I went home to visit my parents. My parents loved him just as much as I did. By the end of college, we were inseparable, and we were on the fast track to being engaged. However, near to our graduation, the first big red flag presented itself. We were talking about what we were planning to do after we graduated, and things became a little heated.
So when we graduate, do you want to live with my parents, or did you want to rent a place near them?
Well, actually, I was hoping that we would keep living close to the college. I like going to visit our families, but I'm liking the idea of us being independent to some degree. Couldn't we rent a place here for a while?
You can't be serious? No. We are moving to be close to my parents. We always do what you want to do, and for once, we will do what I want to. I'm going to be the husband, and you should learn to do as I say.
I had no idea where this was coming from. Mark had never expressed such views before, and the way he was looking at me made me feel a bit scared. If I didn't know any better, I would have run away, as Mark looked like he was seconds away from slapping me. I was so scared that I ran out of the room, and we didn't talk for days. Mark reached out and apologized for the way he spoke. He promised me that he was acting off due to the stress of exams and our upcoming graduation, and that while it was inexcusable, that it would also never happen again. I loved him so much, and I wanted to believe him, and his reasons did make sense. I chose to not mention what happened to anyone, though, as I was worried what they might think. At any rate, the years passed and Mark and I got married. We decided to settle down in the same city that we went to college in, as it was a good midpoint in between our parents. Both my mom and dad and his were 1 hour away but in opposite directions, so we felt it was a good compromise. Then one day we got amazing news. We had been trying for a while to have a baby, and suddenly I noticed that I was getting nauseous a lot in the morning. So I took a pregnancy test and it came back saying that I was pregnant. We were so excited that we could barely contain our enthusiasm. We began buying things like a crib and even began preparing a nursery for the upcoming baby. Everything was going absolutely perfect. We even made plans for our parents to come out and visit us so that we could have a big celebration together. The day before our parents were scheduled to arrive, Mark had to work late, and so it was my job to tidy up the house and to go and buy all the groceries that we would need for their visit. I was so flustered and nervous about them coming to visit us that I bought seafood, specifically shrimp, which my father loves more than any other food on this planet, but Mark's mother is deathly allergic to. When I got home, I realized my mistake and I just put it aside, since I knew that we could just save it for another time when his mother wasn't visiting. But Mark saw the boxes of shrimp and grew incredibly irritated with me.
Why did you buy shrimp?
Oh yes, sorry about that. I forgot that your mother was allergic when I was at the store, but it's okay. I bought plenty of food. We'll just put it aside and eat it when they aren't here.
I want to believe you, but something tells me that it was intentional. Do you hate my mother? Do you want her to have an allergic reaction and die?
No. Of course I don't. It was an honest mistake, but I put the shrimp aside and we won't cook any of it while your mother is here.
You know full well that it was on purpose. And I thought that you said that you would clean the house. This place is disgusting. Do I really have to work overtime and then come home and do everything here? Can I count on you to not be an idiot for once and do something right?
He was so incredibly angry that he grabbed me by the wrist and began shouting at me and shaking my arm as he spoke. I felt so scared and worried that he might hurt me.
I'm going out for a drive. When I get back, this house better be clean.
And so he left. I was so terrified that even though I was exhausted, I set about cleaning the house as much as I could. Mark didn't come home until the next morning, and when he did, he brought home flowers. Once again, he apologized and promised that it would never happen again, that he was under so much stress from work and the pregnancy that he had lost his temper without realizing it. He swore that he would go and speak to a therapist and that it would never happen again. I knew that I shouldn't have believed him, as this was the second time that it had happened, but since he promised to go to therapy, I thought that that would take care of things. I assumed that he would speak to someone and then things could get back on track. But that wouldn't be the last that I saw of Mark's irrational anger. The next day when our parents came to visit, I was so exhausted, and when they asked why I was so tired, I lied and said that it was due to the pregnancy keeping me awake. They bought my excuse, but when my father saw my wrist as bruised as it was, he became concerned. I had to lie to him and tell him that I had slipped in the tub, but I could tell that he wasn't completely buying that. The rest of the visit went quite well, and 5 months later, I gave birth to a wonderful baby boy. That was the happiest day of my life. Looking into the eyes of my son filled my heart with so much happiness. Days later, we were home and relaxing, and I thought that things were going to be perfect from then on. But it was at that time that Mark began to act almost paranoid all the time. I couldn't understand where his fears were coming from, and I just chalked it up to first-time parenting jitters. He baby-proofed the entire house, but that wasn't enough. When I would take our baby for walks, he would ask me about where I went and who I spoke to. I didn't understand why he was asking so many questions, but then one day I made the mistake of telling him that I had spent an hour speaking with one of the men in the neighborhood who had been walking his own baby, and Mark flipped out.
Why were you talking to him for so long? Is he handsome?
I mean, I guess so. But we were just talking about what our newborns were doing and what we had experienced with them so far.
So he was handsome? Are you planning on leaving me for him?
What? No. No, Mark, I have no plans of ever leaving you.
You got that right.
I didn't know what Mark meant by that, but I was to soon find out. That night when I went to bed, Mark didn't join me. He instead stayed downstairs. I didn't know what he was doing until I woke up in the morning and went to make breakfast and found that all of the doors and windows had been boarded shut. He had nailed wooden boards across all of them. Mark, why on earth did you trap us in the house?
Well, you can't leave me if you can't leave.
What are you talking about? I'm not leaving you, Mark.
Then why were you talking to that other man?
He's our neighbor. I was just talking about our babies. Mark, maybe you should call your therapist. You're scaring me. Mark grew enraged when I said that and lunged at me and tied me up. He was so much stronger than me, and there wasn't anything that I could do to stop him.
There. Now you can never leave.
What are you doing? Mark, you're really scaring me. Untie me. Please. What if our baby needs to be fed?
I can't untie you. If I do, then you'll call the police or you'll run to the neighbors and probably sleep with that guy you talked to yesterday. Admit it. That's what you really want to do, right?
He wasn't making any sense, and I was very worried that he was going to hurt me or my son. Just then the phone rang, and I could see Mark grow even more terrified. In a panic, he gagged me and then answered the phone. It sounded like it was my father who called, as Mark began to tell him that I was unavailable to talk, but he would take a message. I felt so hopeless as I realized that everyone I knew was an hour away and that I was in real danger. Hours passed, and Mark just paced around and acted irrationally. He closed all the blinds in the house and constantly kept checking the doors to make sure they were locked. Then, my father called again, and once again, Mark told him that I was too busy to talk. I didn't know what to do, or even what I could do. I was tied up, and no matter how I struggled, I couldn't free myself, and I couldn't reason with Mark as he had gagged me, so I was left helpless and afraid. Another few hours later, we heard a knock at the front door, and when Mark went to check on it, he found no one there. While he was checking it, though, I saw the back door slowly unlock, and my father came in there. He saw me tied up on the floor, and instantly went into a rage, but he snuck around until he could get the drop on Mark. Mark hadn't noticed him sneak in and had slammed the front door shut, and then went to check the back door. As he did, my father surprise attacked him and jumped on him, and while on top of him, punched him until Mark was unconscious. He then tied him up and then rushed over to untie me. I was grateful, but I needed to check on my baby, and so I rushed upstairs and saw that he was okay. We then called the police and had Mark taken away. As it turned out, he had never actually gone to see a therapist, and without medication, his condition had worsened, and he had lost touch with reality. I honestly had no idea what he would have done if my father hadn't come over to rescue me. As it turned out, when Mark had told him that I wasn't available twice, he had grown suspicious and had made the drive out to see if I needed help with the baby. When he saw that the house's blinds were all closed during the day, he grew even more suspicious and had chosen to ring the doorbell and hide and see who answered the door. When he saw Mark answer the door and looking nervous and a bit manic, he decided to let himself in through the back door with the spare key that I had given him. Once he saw me tied up, he knew that his suspicions were correct and he needed to save me. Mark did end up going to prison, but only for a little bit until he was transferred to a facility that could help him, although I think he might be there for the rest of his life. He has become so paranoid that he sees everyone as a danger to himself, and is incredibly dangerous to be around as he lashes out at people randomly. It makes me sad that he ended up that way, but I also know that there isn't anything I could have done to stop it from happening to him. I am just grateful that my father had the intuition to come and rescue me. There is no telling what tragedy might have befallen me had he not. So what do you think? He's kind of the father of the year, no?
Before I could dare to utter a word, he sent a resounding slap across my face which sent me flying and landing painfully on my butt. While I groaned in pain, the man continued yelling at me, raining all sorts of insults on me. I managed to pull myself up. But sir... Oh, you still have the guts to speak. I turned to Caitlin, yelling, as the man effortlessly yanked me off the floor and began walking to a door. Help me! Help me! I screamed, but both women simply stood and watched him take me away. It happened so fast. Before I could do anything, he threw me off the balcony of the second floor of their mansion. I fell on my butt again, and the back of my head hit the wall. I met Caitlin 7 months ago at a mall. She was there making some purchases, but when she went to pay, she couldn't find her card. I felt sorry for her and decided to step in, and I helped her. She was so grateful that we exchanged contact information and became friends. 3 months later, I asked her to be my girlfriend, and we've dating ever since. Now, I'm in my early 30s, and Caitlin would be 30 in a few months. So I was ready to settle down with someone, and Caitlin honestly seemed like the perfect woman for me. We were out on a date at a restaurant one day when I asked if she could introduce me to her parents. Caitlin was surprised. According to her, it seemed too early since we'd only been dating for 3 months. I wanted to drop the issue, but I also wanted her family to know me before I proceeded with any plans. The only thing I could do was try to convince her more without giving away the fact that I wanted to know them before I proposed to her. Eventually, she agreed, and we set a date for the meeting. Was I nervous? A little. I mean, it's normal to be. On the day I was to see them, I made sure that I looked my best. I had a great haircut and dressed handsomely. I also rented a car, as it didn't feel nice to go in a taxi. Caitlin had already sent the address to me, so I drove over to the place. I was shocked to see her family's mansion. I called my girlfriend to inform her about my arrival, and she came out smiling and led me in. My jaw dropped as we walked into the mansion. The house was incredibly opulent. I had no idea that her family was so wealthy, and I tried my best not to show it as I was ushered into the living room where 2 people sat. I knew by just seeing her face that the woman was her mother. The resemblance was insane. I guessed the man to be her father, but I was wrong.
This is my mom and my uncle. Y'all, meet Jay, my boyfriend.
Her mother was welcoming. She stood up and embraced me, asking various questions about me, but her uncle continuously glared at me from where he sat, without a word. After exchanging pleasantries with her mother, Caitlin pulled me toward her uncle.
Uncle Sam, meet my boyfriend. He's been dying to see you both.
The words that came out of his mouth next shocked me beyond belief.
Well, you could have let him die. How could you think of dating a black man, Caitlin?
I cleared my throat. I'd encountered quite a handful of racists, so I thought I knew just how to handle him. I flashed him a smile and said, "I'm black, but I'm a good man, Uncle. I'll be good to Kate." That sentence seemed to spark a feeling of anger inside of him. He stood up, his incredible height making him tower above me. Right in my face, he barked,
"You are black! You are bad! Bad men can't date my niece!"
Before I could dare to utter a word, he sent a resounding slap across my face which sent me flying and landing painfully on my butt. While I groaned in pain, the man continued yelling at me, raining all sorts of insults on me. I managed to pull myself up. "But sir..."
"Oh, you still have the guts to speak."
I turned to Caitlin, yelling as the man effortlessly yanked me off the floor and began walking to a door. "Help me! Help me!" I screamed, but both women simply stood and watched him take me away. It happened so fast. Before I could do anything, he threw me off the balcony of the 2nd floor of their mansion. I fell on my butt again, and the back of my head hit the wall. I remained at the spot, in deep pain, my nose and head bleeding. Caitlin rushed out to see if I was hurt.
Come back into the house with me. He'll be convinced about your love for me if you do.
I couldn't believe my ears. She wasn't even apologizing. "Caitlin, I was almost killed by your uncle just now," I reminded her, but she was more concerned about me going back into the house. I pushed her hands off me and managed to pull myself up. She watched as I staggered out of the compound and got into my rented car. I stuffed tissues in my nostrils to absorb the blood while I managed to drive back home. I honestly had no idea how I was able to do that without crashing into other cars. My vision was blurry, and I thought I'd faint at any moment, but I didn't. Once I got home, I collapsed tiredly on the floor. The next day, after I'd treated my wounds, I got a call from Caitlin.
Will you be coming today, honey? My uncle is waiting.
I was pissed off. How could she dare to ask me to come back after what that man had done to me? That bastard almost killed me, and you want me to go back there?
Don't be a weakling, honey. My uncle simply wanted to test your strength. I feel sad already that you didn't pass his test.
I was dumbfounded. How could she be defending her uncle's behavior? For a second, I thought I had heard her incorrectly, only to have her confirm that she was. She also said she'd want me to come take the test again so her uncle would be convinced that I was real with her. That made me even more shocked. Do you know what your uncle has done to me? My head is broken. Same with my nose. My whole body hurts, and you want me to come back?
Come on, don't be such a weakling. My uncle could harm you, but he'll never kill you. It's just a test.
It was the first time I was seeing how red the flag was. In that moment, I was so thankful that I'd gone to see her family early on in the relationship. It would have been worse if I'd waited until we were already engaged or had been dating for a long time. I can't do this with you anymore, Kate. I'm breaking up with you, I told her. She pretended to not hear, so I repeated my words, which angered her greatly. She hurled all manner of insults at me and repeatedly called me a shameless weakling. I was done listening to her, and so I hung up. Caitlin tried reaching me throughout the day, but I didn't pick up her calls or even reply to her texts, which were filled with curses. The pain in my head increased with each passing day. After a week, it felt like my head was going to explode, and I was forced to visit a hospital. There, the doctor informed me that I was injured internally. He told me that the injury was so severe that I could have died if I had waited any longer to seek help. He told me that I would need emergency surgery immediately. I excused myself to call Caitlin. Can I speak to your uncle? Put it on loudspeaker. She was excited, thinking I finally wanted to settle things. After a minute, I heard her uncle's voice. Hey, weakling. I ignored his words and went straight to telling him that I was going to have surgery, and since he was the one that had caused my wounds, that he needed to cover the costs. I won't give you any money, you weak man. Die if you want.
I can't believe you'd stoop so low as to request money from my uncle.
I expected such reactions from them, but I had no choice. And so I went ahead with my surgery, making sure to document everything with my camera. I was at the hospital for 2 weeks, during which I arranged to meet with a lawyer, and I explained everything to them, including my plans to press charges against Kate's uncle and to have him arrested. Once I'd fully recovered, the hospital discharged me, and 3 days later, I went to Caitlin's house with some policemen. Her uncle made a huge fuss and swore and threatened them, but in the end, they took him away. A month later, we were summoned to appear in court for his hearing. I showed all the evidence I had gathered and gave my testimony on what he had done to me. The case was adjourned, but her uncle remained in detention. Caitlin met me outside the courtroom.
How dare you do this to my uncle? Withdraw your charges and apologize to my Uncle Sam, or you'll regret this.
You should be the one worrying about that. I will not withdraw my charges.
Ugh, I hate you so much. I hope you get hit by a car and die.
I ignored her and walked away, my determination to put her uncle behind bars undeterred. We returned to court a week later, and he was asked to serve a year in prison for harming an innocent individual and to pay up all the money I spent at the hospital, which was a lot. He did end up paying, and I was extremely grateful, as I wouldn't have been able to afford to pay those medical bills on my own. Caitlin's uncle was a wealthy man, and also the one taking care of them, and while he was in prison, Caitlin and her mother were forced to dip into his fortune. They were unemployed and didn't have any experience working, and he had given them access to his finances. By the time he got out, he discovered that the two of them had spent all of his money and had amassed huge debts in his name. They had no concept of financial responsibility and left him ruined. Unfortunately, he had lost his job due to being in prison, so he no longer had a way to make any money and try to dig himself out of the mess that they had put him in. Also, their neighbors knew about what he had done, so they spread the news around, and somehow, it managed to get to the ears of his employers. That added to the reason they refused to take him back. It was bad enough that their employee was a convict, but for them to be associated with a racist man looked bad for their company. Since they barely had any money, he was forced to sell their mansion so he could pay off their debt and use the rest to rent a small apartment for them. The stress from losing his job and mansion was too much for him to take, and he began drinking heavily to escape from reality. Unfortunately, he was a very mean drunk, and he began to take out his frustrations on Kate and her mother. It didn't take much for them to anger him, and he became physically and verbally abusive. One day, he got so violent that he broke Kate's mother's leg bad enough that she would never be able to walk without the aid of a walker again. After that, they realized that they couldn't take it anymore and chose to run away, leaving him all alone, jobless, and frustrated. Caitlin and her mother came to my house to beg for my forgiveness, but I released my dogs and had them chase them out. Recently, I heard her uncle committed suicide, and Caitlin now works as a cleaner at a mall to take care of her now crippled mother. Even though it was quite petty, I decided to visit the mall, and I intentionally dropped a bottle of wine on the ground. Seconds later, Caitlin showed up to clean up the mess. Her face was filled with embarrassment as she stared at me. With a mocking laugh, I threw some dollar notes on the floor for the broken bottle, brushed her off, and walked out of the mall, my heart filled with happiness. I ran to him and pulled his shirt, begging him to talk to my mother, but he couldn't say a word. He stood at a spot, staring into nothing with tears streaming down his eyes. We begged my mother until she reached the gate.
Get away from me, you stupid things from a useless man.
She yelled and kicked us off carelessly. With the force she kicked us with, my sister got a terrible injury on her forehead that had blood gushing out of it. I ran back into the house as fast as my short legs could carry me, wailing. Hi there. My name's Alex. I am 30-year-old living in a serene part of Australia. My mother left my sister and I when I was only 7 years of age. My father was a gentleman. They got married 3 years before I was born. They'd both planned to start having kids immediately after marriage, but failed. The doctor said my mother was having a problem with her womb and had to be on medication. My father was fine with it. For 2 years, my mother was on medications. My father was patient. Even though he badly wanted kids, he endured with her until the doctor confirmed her to be fine. 1 year later, she got pregnant with me. You can tell that my father was the happiest man on earth to hear the news from her. 2 years after my birth, she took in for my sister, and 3 years later, she gave birth to my brother. A year after his birth, my mother began nagging terribly.
Why are you just returning from work? Don't you know your children and I need you?
My father always apologized. On days when he was home, he would spend all of his time with us. Still, my mother wasn't appreciative. Soon, he caught her cheating with a colleague of hers at the new place she began working at. Prior to that, she'd begun exhibiting even worse behaviors.
I work all day. Have you no ounce of pity for me, you stupid man?
On the day he caught her, they had a fight the previous night. I knew because their loud noises woke me up and I was forced to leave my room.
What have I not done for you, Jane? I've done everything I can to be a good husband and keep this family whole.
Oh, keep your sermons to yourself. What have you done that no other man hasn't? If you make me pissed, I'm gonna leave you.
I was scared to hear that threat. I rushed back to my room and buried my face in my small pillow, crying. The thought of my mother leaving us scared me. That fateful day, my father returned home looking utterly disorganized. His eyes also looked like mine whenever I cried so much, and that filled my small mind with worry. "Are you okay, Daddy?" He looked up at me with a smile and assured me that he was. In that heartbroken state he prepared dinner, fed us, gave us our night bath before putting us to sleep. 2 hours later, I woke up from a nightmare. I dashed out of my room and went to my parents', but no one was there. I went to the living room, only to see my dad sitting on the floor, still in his office clothes, tears rolling down his eyes. I couldn't go to him. I turned and headed back to my room. I would later come to know that after he caught them in her office, my mother had told him to his face that the man was the new person she loved, and he and his children could go kill themselves for all she cared. For 2 weeks, my mother didn't return home. Whenever we asked my dad, he would say she was on an important trip and would be back soon. 3 weeks later, she returned home with my father's parents.
I admit my mistakes. Please forgive me. I was out of my mind. I promise it will never repeat itself.
My grandparents also joined in pleading for my father's forgiveness. Eventually, he did. She returned home and quit her job. For the first 2 months, she was a great wife. She took care of us properly, spent more than enough time with us, and also became a loving wife to my father. We had no idea what she was planning. One night, while we were all watching a movie in the living room, my mother's phone rang. The call took barely 10 seconds. After the first word and an okay, she excused herself and left the living room. When she reappeared, she was with a bag and 2 boxes. My father was alarmed.
What are you doing, babe? Where are you going?
I'm leaving, you fool. I'm going to start my life with a man who cares for me.
My father was confused. He thought she'd changed. She suddenly grabbed my brother.
Just so you know, Jacob isn't your son. My son, his father, and I are going to start a new life of our own.
That night, we cried and pleaded with her, but she was bent on leaving. We were young, so the thought of separating with our mother and brother was too much for us. My father was dumbfounded. I ran to him and pulled his shirt, begging him to talk to my mother, but he couldn't say a word. He stood at a spot, staring into nothing with tears streaming down his eyes. We begged my mother until she reached the gate.
Get away from me, you stupid things, from a useless man.
She yelled and kicked us off carelessly. With the force she kicked us with, my sister got a terrible injury on her forehead that had blood gushing out of it. I ran back into the house as fast as my short legs could carry me, wailing. Mother kicked Abby. She's crying blood from her head. My father snapped out of his shocked state and dashed out of the house. I grabbed his car keys and ran after him. We met my sister unconscious. It took a week before she finally woke up in the hospital. She lost a lot of blood. The fall nearly affected her brain. The wound left a huge scar on her forehead that made her insecure for years. We finally returned home after spending almost 4 weeks at the hospital. In tears, my father calmly explained the situation to us. Even in that moment, he pleaded with us to not hate our mother, but it was unacceptable for my sister and I. We despised her from that young age. 10 years later, while we were spending time with our father at a park, his phone suddenly rang. He was happy to see that the caller was my mother. He quickly called for our attention and answered the call, putting it on loudspeaker.
Hey, loser. I'm calling to tell you that I'm leaving the life I've always dreamed of. My extremely wealthy husband takes good care of my son and I. I hope you and your children continue wallowing in poverty.
I lost it there and was about to speak, but she hung up. My father wasn't poor, he wasn't rich, but we were satisfied with his level. How could she be so evil to him and us, her innocent children? My hatred for her increased even more. That call brought back all the emotions he'd been locking in, and my father fell into depression. He tried his best for 2 years to defeat it, but his best didn't seem enough. 3 years later, my father committed suicide. He left us an apology note and the password to the safe he'd been saving money for the past 20 years. Although we were devastated by the loss of our father, the wealth he left behind managed to console us. With that money, I made good investments and trained my sister and I throughout our education years. My mother returned, 8 years after my father died, looking old and haggard. According to her story, her husband and Jacob had died in a car accident. His real wife and his family came and sent her out with nothing. She begged for our forgiveness, and I accepted. My sister was furious, but I let her know that I have a plan. For 1 year, I ensured we both lived with my mother in the only mansion I had in America. We showed her all the love she could ask for and treated her better than she could ever imagine. After that year, I sold the house without her knowledge. I rounded up everything I had to do in America. One night, while all 3 of us were watching a movie, I got a call from my manager that my flight was ready. I signaled to my sister, and we both excused ourselves. We grabbed a bag and 2 boxes each, the remaining properties we had there, and walked back to the living room. My mother was surprised and asked where we were going. This was the same way you left us, years ago. The owner of this house and everything in it is coming tomorrow, so you better evacuate. The cars outside have all been sold. For your bank account, my manager has taken every penny I left there. We're leaving this country, and we pray to never see you again. Just like we did that night, my mother begged, nearly crying her eyes out. When we got to the gate, I pushed her, but she was lucky enough to land safely. We walked out, and my second manager was waiting by the gate with a car. We got in, and he drove off. I turned to catch a smirk on my sister's face. With a smile, I asked her if she's happy.
More than happy. I did something too. I figured your plan wouldn't be enough payback, so I planned mine. Yesterday, I injected her with HIV patient blood, telling her it will make her look younger, and she believed it. Then I later posted her pictures on social media with caption, "Beware of this sexy HIV patient."
Next day, I received a call from my neighbors, informing me that the following day, the property owners arrived, and my mother adamantly refused to leave. Unfortunately, the situation escalated, resulting in her being beaten. The police were subsequently called, leading to her arrest, and she's now facing a sentence for trespassing. Hope we did the right thing?